I'm David Lombardo, and this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room. This spring, Democratic state lawmakers pushed through a bill updating the statutory guidelines for emergency response planning by utilities, which garnered major attention from state policymakers in the wake of Hurricane Sandy in 2012 and again after major storms in 2018. For more on this timely restoration of utility services after an emergency, we're joined by Assemblymember Steve Otis, a Westchester County Democrat who sponsored the bill updating New York's expectations for utility providers. Thanks for making the time, Assemblymember.
Great to be with you, Dave, and an important topic of concern to New Yorkers all over the state.
Yeah, and as I mentioned at the top, this issue has gotten attention multiple times over the last decade and a half. So what is it about the status quo framework that isn't working for you?
Well, I would say we've seen some improvement by the utilities over the years, but the key thing that this legislation calls for is that in the emergency response plans that they file with the Public Service Commission, that they include some time-based goals in terms of restoration. And what this really ties into is the availability of staffing to respond to storms. And so before and after Sandy, what was traditional was that New York utilities depended upon mutual aid, sometimes coming from Canada, sometimes coming from Washington State, Louisiana. And what was more the practice and still sometimes occurs is we're waiting for a few days before even restoration efforts begin. And so what we want is the emergency management plans to really detail more that they are staffing response times with a quicker response with people, even if they're coming on a mutual aid basis or contracted out basis, that they are able to deploy more quickly than 3 days away. And some of the issue it relates also to different utilities have different staffing levels of their own organizations, and periodically the Public Service Commission reminds utilities that they need to staff appropriately for a proper response time. And so it's a combination of outside contractors, mutual aid, and local staffing. The plan should really have the aspirational goal and schedule, understanding that all storms are different, that they're at least trying to restore as quickly as possible.
Is there reason to believe, though, that utilities aren't trying to restore power as quickly as possible? Are there reasons to believe, for example, that they are ignoring or just simply not utilizing more readily available staff that is potentially in states closer than across the country or other countries like Canada?
Well, I think that it is something, there's been an evolution, and I think that's a good thing. But it becomes a nuts and bolts matter of how many trucks and how many responders you can put into the field within 24 hours. And so the plans should be geared towards trying to move quickly. So instead of depending upon Washington State or somebody from the deep south that's going to take days to get here, they should, in combination with proper staffing levels locally, be ready to move more quickly. And that's the purpose of the bill, to make sure that that's outlined in the plans.
What sort of flexibility is there, though, for the event of a regional storm, for example? Because if something hits New York City, it might also hit New Jersey or Connecticut. So you really can't expect help from those neighboring states, and maybe that's why you have to turn to the Deep South or across the country in Washington.
Well, that's true in some circumstances, but I will share maybe about 5 years ago, we had a storm north of Albany, north of the Capital District. It was not a regional, whole nor'east storm. And it took the utility there a number of days to deploy people anyway, even though it was sort of an isolated to a limited geographic area. So the responsibility really has to be on utilities to do the best they can to deploy quickly and have staffing to do that. And I mean, going post Sandy and pre Sandy as well, we had in our area in Westchester County, we had some storms where people were out of electricity for 5 or 6 days. really not acceptable under any set of circumstances. And it's an ongoing process. One thing that the bill does provide for is the Public Service Commission is going to set the benchmarks. And also, there are different kinds of storms. So you mentioned a storm that covers whole half of the country. Those are considerations that the Public Service Commission would make in evaluating after the fact whether a utility has responded accordingly.
Right now, if utilities don't meet certain consumer performance metrics, they can potentially be fined by the Public Service Commission. So I have to imagine if someone is going 4, 5, 6 days without power, they're probably not going to give the most favorable review of their utilities. So why isn't that consumer protection enough to ensure compliance, or at least the most vigorous efforts by utilities to restore power?
Well, given the fact that those penalties have been in place for many years, and we've seen varied response in terms of big storms, it is not enough, I think. And I think the key thing is if the plan itself is in a more granular way dealing with time-based restoration, with that in mind, a little more on top of assembling manpower in a timely basis to meet the time goals in their plan, will get better results and people will be out for a shorter period of time. And it's also not just residential customers. This puts businesses out of service for a few days as well if we have a prolonged outage. So everybody, I think, is in favor of the same goals. The question is, are we staffing? Do we have a readiness plan adequate to deal with the storms that we get? And I'd also add, we're getting more severe storms and we're getting more frequent storms. So the importance of fine tuning our planning process is, I think, more important than ever.
Well, before we move on, let me reintroduce you. For listeners just joining us, I'm David Lombardo, and this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're speaking with Assemblymember Steve Otis, a Westchester County Democrat who's looking to update the emergency response planning process by New York's utilities. So it seems like whenever you make a change to utility, there's always some sort of reaction, and some of those might be unanticipated. So, given that backdrop, how was this bill written in a way to prevent unintended consequences? For example, maybe it costs more to get a response or help from those local utilities in the region, and maybe it'll drive up costs to ratepayers in the future. I mean, the bill memo says no fiscal implication to the state or, I think, local governments. So how did you go about trying to prevent unintended consequences with this bill?
Well, certainly giving the parameters, the decision on the parameters to the Public Service Commission rather than in the statute itself is one way to do that. But I'd also say the structure for this is already in place. There is a planning process in state law now that we are amending. So this is really just providing a little focus on readiness to make sure that there is a proper attention paid to staffing adequately, either through paid staff on the utility payroll, outside contractors, which they use, or the mutual aid. I'll also say that after storm events, it is not unusual for the Public Service Commission, where there are deficiencies, to send letters to the utilities to say, in this storm, you really should have had better manpower, or other kinds of things that are revealed in the event. So there's always a post-storm analysis. This really just provides a pre-storm, a better framework for planning on the basis of the utilities themselves. And having been through some of these ice storms where these things, you're out for a number of days, and where my constituents suffered great frustration. Some people who are working from home, they're knocked out from not just the convenience of being at home, but they can't do their work that they have to do as well. So we all want lights turned on as quickly as possible. This is a good next step.
If we give the utilities, though, the benefit of the doubt and assume that they are trying to return power as fast as possible, but with a understanding that doing so might cost more than if you take a few extra days to do it, do you think that should be part of the calculation? Is there some sort of metric or cost to timeliness that you think should be part of this calculation? Or should the goal be restore power as fast as possible, no matter what the cost?
The economic cost of prolonged outages to customers, to our economy, is much greater than making sure that you have enough troops on the ground. Uh,
How do we
but
know that?
because if you put a region of the state out of business for 5 days, that has huge economic impacts for businesses, for families. The matter of deployment, yes, there's a cost to that, but that's the cost of running a utility. And so there are other states that are do focus on timely restoration readiness. So we would not be alone. I don't think this is a dramatic change. It is the kind of detail that has been lacking in terms of some of the response times, and the utilities have improved. So I am not. I don't want to be anything other than accurate. The utilities over the past 15 years have improved. They're now more prone to, in some circumstances, when they're getting mutual aid from around the country, flying people in rather than having them drive their vehicles across the country. And so some of that is going on. And the Public Service Commission has played a good role behind the scenes with the utilities, encouraging them to be good stewards of the restoration process.
Well, lastly, thinking about the state's utility regulator, the Public Service Commission, how important is it for the success of a measure like this that the Public Service Commission is aggressively enforcing its expectations of these types of emergency plans moving forward?
I think it's very important, but they do a job now in terms of analyzing the storm response already, and certainly very involved after Sandy, after Ida, and the other storms that we've had of a more local nature. They do a pretty good job of analyzing storm events and getting back to utilities, and that's been a positive dialogue. So having been around, we had hearings after Sandy. If you remember, there was a Moreland Act commission established, and there were some changes in the law done then. This is something that even after those changes were implemented, we continued to see deficiencies in terms of length of outages, and that's what this bill is intended to respond to.
Well, we've been speaking with Assemblymember Steve Otis. He is a Westchester County Democrat. Assemblymember, thank you so much for making the time. Really appreciate it.
Dave, always a pleasure. Keep up the good work of journalism in the state capitol. You folks are very important to keeping the whole place going as well. So thank you, Dave. We'll speak to you soon.
Support for the Capitol Press Room comes from O'Donnell and Associates, a public affairs firm providing strategic guidance to businesses and nonprofits on navigating policy and regulatory issues. More information is available at o'donnellsolutions.com.